I'm ready. So today we're here to talk about Mary Roberts Rinehart. By way of content warning for any of you who are not already familiar with her works or any aspects of her life, there will be reference to several deaths, both real and fictional, during the course of this talk. And those deaths include examples of suicide, drowning, and cancer. So if any of those are particularly sensitive subjects for you, please be aware. And a little introduction of myself. I am a writer, and I am originally from the Pittsburgh area, like Mary Roberts Rinehart, um, which I was thrilled to discover when I found her, although like many of you, I assume I did not grow up reading her. I discovered her later. Now, because she was such a prolific writer, we are not going to have time to cover all of her writing. This talk will focus primarily on her mysteries and especially on her supernatural inspired mysteries. But we are going to begin with some biography. Mary Ella Roberts was born in 1876 in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, which is now what's known as the North Side in Pittsburgh. She had a younger sister named Olive, who would also eventually become a writer specializing in children's books. Their parents were Cornelia Gilliland and Thomas Beveridge Roberts. They also lived with their grandmother for a while during childhood, and their Uncle John, their father's brother, was a significant person in their early life. The family really depended upon John in a lot of ways for financial support. Um, Mary's grandmother worked as a seamstress, as did her mother. Thomas sold sewing machines primarily, but really he was an inventor. And although many of his inventions were successful, they were not very lucrative. He missed a few opportunities when he could have made more money from them because he was holding out for better chances that he thought would come. And of course, some of his time that he wanted to focus on his inventions was taken away from the day job, various sales, but mostly the sewing machines. He hated his day job. And Mary describes him as having been a somewhat distant father. He was really much more focused on his invention, that passion, and his family came second. Thomas was also somewhat different from the rest of the family in that while they were rather religious, Presbyterian, they had come from Covenanter stock, Mary says in her autobiography. But Thomas was not religious. He did not go to church with the rest of the family. He had taken a dislike to organized religion. During Mary's childhood, she had a number of strange experiences that sparked an early interest in crime and human nature and the stranger, more scandalous aspects of human relationships. When she was very young, Mary was briefly abducted She managed to get away from the place where her abductor had kidnapped her and get in touch with adults who were able to help her. And later, she had the experience of being shown a photograph and asked to identify the woman who abducted her. And she says in her autobiography that she was always worried that her memory hadn't been right, that she hadn't identified the right woman, and what if she had accidentally accused the wrong person? So that early interest in crime and the emotions involved with it, for victims, for the falsely accused, was planted very early. There was also an incident when she went to an exposition with her aunt, and a balcony that they were standing on that was overloaded with pianos and not strong enough to support the weight collapsed, and Mary had a spike impale her jaw, which left a permanent scar. Although, obviously, she did not suffer any major damage. Um, so the unexpected and random catastrophes were also part of her early experience, as were the strange and supernatural. Although throughout her life, Mary's opinion of the supernatural tended towards the skeptical but an open minded sort of skepticism. Um, she relates a story of how, when she was very young, she was afraid that a room in the house that they were living in might have been haunted. Um, she also brings this up in relation to a visit that the family experienced from a phrenologist, and that interest and intrigue, both with words and with um, both science and pseudoscience, and the uh, interesting aspects of this time period when the urge to do scientific examination is giving rise to what we now consider to be pseudoscience and very dubious sort of scientific experiments, was something that she became inquisitive about. Because of the family's precarious financial situation, um, eventually Uncle John's business wasn't doing as well, and various members of the family suffered from health issues. Particularly cancer ran in the family, and so Mary's aunt and a few other relatives had health complaints related to that. So finances were strained, and Mary was eager to contribute to help out her family. Observation of a woman doctor in the neighborhood initially inspired her to want to become a doctor, but she was too young to be able to go to medical school, and impatient to start being able to contribute. So she changed her mind to becoming a nurse. And Pittsburgh had a nurse training school associated with the homeopathic hospital, which would later become Shadyside Hospital in Pittsburgh, was one of the first nurse training schools in America. So she had that opportunity. Her family wasn't completely thrilled, but they needed the money. So they let her have her way. And through the entry into nurse training school, Mary met Stanley Rinehart. Now, Technically, when Mary entered training school, she was actually even too young for that, but she sort of lied and fudged her way through. Uh, Stanley Rinehart was recently graduated from medical school, a new doctor. He was the one who initially took her to the hospital and showed her around. He tried to talk her out of becoming a nurse because a lot of women didn't really know what they were getting into when they first decided to become a nurse. And so he tried to make sure she knew the realities, but Mary persisted. And throughout her time there, they initially didn't have much contact, but Mary soon proved that she had the stomach for assisting in the surgical rooms. And because he was a surgeon, that brought them into more contact. Their courtship was against the hospital rules, but one of the people in charge of the hospital was Stanley's brother. So when they got caught during their courtship, he basically just pitched a fit and told them that he was going to marry Mary and that they could just put up with it, and they did. While Mary was at nurse training school, her family experienced some tragedies. Her grandmother shockingly fell down the stairs and died unexpectedly, and then her father killed himself. He went to Buffalo, checked into a hotel room, and shot himself. And Mary uh, found out while she was on a nursing assignment, um, and was even more shocked when she looked it up in the newspaper and discovered that she was mentioned in the newspaper article about the suicide because her father had been carrying a letter from her among his possessions. That suicide definitely impacted her. Suicide occasionally comes up in her writing, including in Sight Unseen, which is one of the novels that we're going to be talking about later. She also wrote nonfiction articles about it on occasion. And she definitely struggled with the concept. She had conflicted feelings. On the one hand, she had personal experience of mental illness herself, as well as having observed it in her father and other family members. And she was sympathetic towards that, but she also had a bit of, if I can deal with it and move on, other people should be able to do that as well, and why can't they? Frustration, where she wasn't always as sympathetic as she might have been. It was an illness that first got Mary to begin writing. She had been dabbling in it, had occasionally had a magazine. It was a way that she was sometimes able to make a little extra money to buy luxuries that the family budget couldn't allow for. Um, but she hadn't really seriously considered trying to pursue writing as a career. But while she was ill, a nurse prompted her into entertaining herself during her convalescence by writing, having pointed out to her uh, advertisement in a magazine that said that they were accepting submissions. Mary's initial focus was primarily on verse, and a lot of that verse was intended for children. And she says herself that her verse was very bad. Um, a lot of it is humorous as well, including this example in which she talks about the detective story and specifically focuses on the ways that clues unfold during detective stories. And she sort of makes fun of the way that the clues are always presented as being these absolute, definite, only one possible interpretation kind of ideas, and comes around to the conclusion that the detective stories basically tell the reader how to get away with crime, uh, how to fool the detective, because now we know that the detective is going to follow these clues like they are the law. But it was the Panic of 1903, in which she and Stanley lost a significant amount of money, that would lead her to start really focusing on her writing. They were in debt. They could not pay off the debt on Stanley's income alone. So she wrote. She had some poems occasionally published, a short story here and there. Eventually, the editor of Munsey's magazine persuaded her to try her hand at writing longer fiction. Um, and in addition to that little nudge of confidence was a comment that her Uncle John had made, saying that her stories had enough plot in them for several novels. Um, so she, as she was teaching herself writing and getting feedback, started to realize that she could write the kinds of things that she liked to read, which included a lot of mystery stories, including those by Anna Catherine Green. And when she eventually got her first novel published, she picked which publisher to send it to by pulling an Anna Catherine Green novel off of her bookshelf and looking up who had published it. Now, throughout her career, she had a tendency to insist that she really wasn't a career writer. She went back and forth a lot. She talked about writing in very serious terms as being a thing that she put professional work into. At one point in time, she actually rented an office so that she could have space to work alone without distractions. But despite that, she continuously insisted that motherhood always came first for her. Her family always came first for her. Um, and that if she had to pick one, she would pick her family. And this is reflected in a lot of her writings. Um, in The Street of Seven Stars, for example, that heroine winds up choosing her marriage over her career. Um, so, despite the fact that as we continue, we'll see Mary did a lot of things that one would not assume a mother would do if she was solely dedicated to being a housewife and mother. Um, her motherhood and her family were extremely important to her. And eventually, she kind of combined the two. She helped her sons set up a publishing company, Farrar and Rinehart, in 1929, and left the publisher that she had been with to move her publishing all over to her son's new company. The Circular Staircase was Mary's first published novel. Um, Although the actual timeline of her writing, due to the serialization and then the being published, there's some overlap between The Circular Staircase and The Man in Lower 10. Um, the Circular Staircase is a great example of what readers could come to expect from Mary's writing. It is a mystery. It features the had I but known techniques that Mary would become known for, and that other writers would imitate so much that it became considered a cliche of mystery writing, and was one of the factors in Mary's popularity eventually waning. In some ways, she was so successful that she was too successful. um, The circular staircase was inspired by a visit to a Gothic revival home that had an interesting staircase. It was also probably partially inspired by the thaw scandal in Pittsburgh. There is reference to a country club in the novel, and uh, the Thaws attended the country club that was quite near to where Mary lived. It was originally serialized, later published as a book, and critics loved it, audiences loved it. It sold terrifically. Um, and the thing that both the critics and the audiences really were impressed by was Mary's combination of humor with the crime mystery story. This wasn't common at the time. Um, and it was considered refreshing and delightful. Uh, and it set Mary up well for her future success with other novels. There's a picture of the house in Pittsburgh where Mary lived at the time that she wrote it, but her early successful writing, especially from the circular staircase, allowed Mary to make enough money that she was able to buy a significantly nicer house, a former mansion, and have it restored so that her family could live in it. And so the Rinehart's lifestyle very quickly became more luxurious. And Mary herself became a literary celebrity in addition to being a successful writer. She wrote articles about her writing. She got involved in playwriting. And through her interest in playwriting, she met Beatrice DeMille, which gave her an in to Hollywood. And she would dabble a bit in movies, although ultimately she didn't enjoy that. She preferred actual stage. Her playwriting experiences were not always successful, and we will come back to that. Um, Mary's career didn't begin with the Saturday Evening Post, but the Saturday Evening Post was a significant part of her career. And most particularly, although most of Mary's works don't involve recurring characters, that's one of the differences between her and Agatha Christie. She doesn't tend to do the detective who comes back and back and back and back again to solve mysteries. But she did have two notable recurring characters, Tish Carberry and Hilda Adams, or Miss Pinkerton, both of whom were published in the Saturday Evening Post. So we have here covers from a Tish story as well as a Hilda Adams story. The cover for the first Saturday Evening Post that Mary was published in. And also just a little fun fact, the Norman Rockwell there at the bottom was the first Norman Rockwell cover for the Saturday Evening Post, and it's a Mary Roberts Rinehart title underneath Norman's first post illustration, which is sort of an indicator of where she was culturally at the time. She was part of that Saturday Evening Post, Norman Rockwell, Americana classic experience that has been both mythologized and then re examined over the course of history. Because of her success with the Saturday Evening Post, when World War One rolled around, Mary was able to go to Europe as a correspondent. Um, she essentially kind of bullied her way into doing this. George Lorimer, who was running things at the Post, didn't really want to send Mary. He told her that she was not his first choice and that he was kind of just going along with it because she was already making the plans to do so. It is extremely likely that Mary's desire to do this was inspired in part by Nellie Bly, who started corresponding very early on in the war. Nellie Bly was also from Pennsylvania, had lived and worked in Pittsburgh during the time period when Mary was growing up and living in Pittsburgh. So Mary certainly would have been not only aware of Nellie Bly the way lots of people in America were aware of Nellie Bly, but had that she's from where I come from, I can do what she can do sort of mentality. While Mary was in Europe, she also inspected field hospitals for the Red Cross. She went to the front lines. She interviewed ordinary soldiers. She uh, went to various countries, interviewed kings and queens in England and in Belgium. She was awarded a medal by the King of Belgium for her service in helping to spread the word about what was going on during the war. And when she returned to America, she was also recruited to do propaganda writing. There were attempts to persuade her to do intelligence work, but she declined that. Um, However, her husband got a job with the Veterans Department in Washington, and the family moved to Washington, and Mary became a hostess for politicians and political types in Washington. And although she did not do official intelligence work, she agreed to pass on any important information that just happened to fall into her lap, if that happened. We don't have time to talk about all of the interesting things that Mary Roberts Rinehart did because she did so much. But here's a small sampling of things that she did throughout the rest of her life. She did travel writing based on both her travels in the Western United States and also foreign countries that she visited at various points in time. At one point, when she was traveling in the West, she met the Blackfeet tribe and became aware of difficult circumstances that the tribe was experiencing. And then she used her political connections in Washington to lobby for the Blackfeet tribe to get better treatment, better supplies. She did some writing to promote the suffragette movement and even considered running for office at one point in time, although nothing wound up coming from her candidacy. But it was certainly unusual for her to be running for office when she could not yet vote for who was running for office. And later in life, when she experienced cancer, she wrote about that experience for the Ladies' Home Journal to help raise awareness, to encourage women to get treatment as soon as possible so that they could have the chance, like she had, of surviving the cancer rather than the tragedy of death that some of her family members had had. So she really was influential in a variety of ways, not just because her fiction was so popular. although it certainly was. um, she didn't write just mysteries, something that sometimes gets overlooked when she's referred to as the American Agatha Christie. But she did write a lot of mysteries, and that's what we're going to primarily be focusing on. She also wrote about writing, and specifically about writing crime stories. And she stresses over and over again that it requires work, that it requires notes and writing and rewriting, that it is important to find ways to reveal while concealing so that not all of the reveals are obvious. She doesn't like the idea of cheap thrills, although her work later gets used to promote cheap thrills. Um, but she did write other kinds of stories, romances. She was particularly a fan of sentimental romances and often incorporates romance side plots into her mysteries. Often her romances have some sort of mystery side plot, even if it's not a murder mystery. So, genre blending is something that she does quite a bit. Um, Her success was substantially increased by The Bat. Now, The Bat is adapted from The Circular Staircase. There were early attempts at plays and a film of The Circular Staircase. They did not do very well. Because they did not do very well, Mary and her co-writer, um, Avery Hopwood, they collaborated on plays specifically because Avery was a playwright. Um, they reworked The Circular Staircase to be different enough to give it a new chance of succeeding. And it worked. The Bat was extremely successful and spawned not only the original Broadway play, but also the 1926 film, a 1930 film, and a 1959 film. And for those of you who don't know, although some of you may have stumbled across it at some point in time, a fun fact about the Bat Whispers is that Bob Kane cited the Bat Whispers as one of the influences for creating Batman. So you can thank Mary Roberts Rinehart indirectly for Batman. We're now going to focus for the remainder of the talk on Mary's spiritualist inspired novels. Now, a huge influence in these novels was Mary's personal experiences with unexplained phenomena, despite the fact that she was largely skeptical. She had, in her autobiography, numerous accounts of sort of strange occurrences. One of her aunts who died of cancer came and talked to her, and there was sort of a weird foretelling of the aunt's death before they were expecting it. Uh, Avery Hopwood told Mary that he knew he was going to die by drowning someday, and eventually he did. And Mary stayed in a few different places, besides just her childhood home already mentioned, that seemed to possibly be haunted. Um, So she was certainly interested in the idea of spiritualism. She was also very interested in investigations into spiritualism. And that comes up in her novels, Sight Unseen and The Red Lamp. Both of these books feature seances that are tied in to crimes that have happened. Sight Unseen was originally serialized in 1916, then later republished as a book in 1921. So it shows that Mary's interest in spiritualism started early when that big World War I boom in spiritualism's popularity was really just starting. Uh, but by the time Sight Unseen got republished and Mary was starting to collect inspiration for the Red Lamp, the spiritualist movement's heyday was in full swing. However, Mary was old enough to be familiar with some of the earlier cases of spiritualists who were exposed as frauds that occurred, especially in the late 19th century. Um, and so that combined with her natural skepticism uh, meant that she didn't take things too seriously. And her coverage of spiritualism in these books involves a mix of phenomenon that don't have any definite explanation, speculation into possible alternate explanations besides the supernatural, and also just the solving of the mystery. Uh, the personal experiences that helped inspire the Red Lamp include staying at a rented house on Long Island in the summer of 1918. That experience specifically involved a lamp as well as knockings and rappings that could not be explained. Sounds like someone was walking overhead in a room where there was not anybody there to be doing the walking. However, that was not Mary's only involvement with spiritualism during this time. In 1921, Mary and her husband hosted a few seances at their home. They did not consider the seances to be conclusive proof of anything, particularly since the medium who claimed to have used Black Hawk and Robert E. Lee as uh, control as spirit guides, which are interesting choices. Um, the use of Native Americans as alleged spirit guides was extremely common in the spiritualist movement of the time, and Mary pokes a bit of fun of that in Sight Unseen. Um, but the medium that Mary attended a seance for brought up her father and her uncle during the seance, and the details, the characterization were not quite right. So Mary was far from convinced, although not as offended as Houdini famously was when Lady Doyle allegedly channeled his mother. But Mary was in contact with Arthur Conan Doyle a little bit. They did write. Um, so there is a Doyle connection, which there's a line in The Red Lamp where Mary pokes a bit of fun at Doyle and the Cottingley Fairies incident. So the fact that she was in correspondence with Doyle is interesting in that regard. Also, there had been a situation when Mary and her family were in an apartment in Washington that had belonged to the late Senator Penrose, who was notoriously profligate in his lifestyle. And tragically, while they were living there, in addition to various unexplained phenomenon, Mary's mother died in an accident getting into her bathtub and drowning. So uh, that incident was interesting in that Mary had made a comment at a dinner party about the possible poltergeist activity at the apartment, and that got spread around Washington. Apparently, other people thought that the apartment might be haunted as well. But there were insinuations made after Mary's mother died that she was blaming the ghost for the tragedy. And although Mary did make vague comments about how the strange phenomenon stopped after her mother's death, she never actually said that she thought her mother had been killed by a ghost. Um, so Mary was certainly wary of the shades and nuances to spiritualist belief. The red lamp is also interesting in that, unlike Mary's usual narration styles, it is told primarily through journal entries. So a lot of readers find the red lamp interestingly different than some of Mary's other work, although it does include classic had I but known traits as well. So it's not completely different. So here we have a couple of quotes from Sight Unseen and The Red Lamp, referring to some of the phenomenon associated with spiritualism, like the wrappings. In many ways to Mary's description of the haunting that she experienced at the house in Long Island. Um, and in the Sight Unseen, there's reference to the idea of mediums being sensitive, the idea that maybe the supernatural isn't the explanation for this. This comes up in both of the books. Throughout them, there are mentions of psychoanalysis, which was relatively new at the time, mentions of telepathy, telekinesis, the idea of a fourth dimension. And it's interesting that many of these things, while being treated more dubiously now, are considered as logical alternate explanations to the supernatural in the context in which they come up in Mary's books. Now, this is partially because the emphasis in those cases is that it's not a supernatural explanation. Um, Many of us don't believe in telepathy or telekinesis now and don't really consider it to be that much more plausible than the supernatural, but just the mere fact that it was not attributing the phenomenon to spirits, but to human ability and laws of nature that we simply hadn't learned how to explain yet, made it seem credible at the time. There were a number of connections between spiritualism and scientific study, which I mentioned somewhat in my talk on Thomas Lynn Bradford. The Thomas Lynn Bradford case was a huge deal that was reported in the newspapers and very likely could have been something that Mary was aware of. And that was a case of a man who attempted to scientifically prove that the dead could talk to the living by killing himself so that his spirit could come back and talk to a prearranged partner. Uh, it was in fact inconclusive as a scientific experiment. There were other inconclusive scientific experiments. However, the vast majority of scientific investigations into mediums did conclude that the mediums were frauds, despite the fact that during this time period, it was mostly people who believed in spiritualism who were investigating the mediums. So that was rather a blow for the spiritualists. But there tends to be this caveat that although this one is a fraud, that doesn't mean there's not someone genuine. And that's a recurring theme in both of these books, that idea that, yes, of course some things are fraud, of course some things are faked. But there are other things that we can't explain, and just because we don't believe in some of this, that doesn't mean that there might not be something. As I mentioned earlier, Mary's popularity did fade somewhat over time. However, her work, although mostly passing into the public domain, did not go out of print. It remained in print, and there are several wonderfully interesting examples of her novels getting fascinating Gothic cover art throughout the 60s and 70s primarily. Dell is the primary uh, culprit of this, as indicated here. These are by no means all of the covers. They're just all of the ones that I could easily fit onto a single slide. um, so a variety of ladies running away from Gothic locales that would give you a terribly misleading idea of the vibe of many of these Mary Roberts Rinehart mysteries. Um, Although there are Gothic elements involved in the description of the setting in the Red Lamp, notably, and the interest in the supernatural and some other Gothic themes, and some of her non-mystery novels also show possible influence from some Gothic tropes. There are multiple male characters with mysterious pasts that come up, for example. So, although it would be incorrect to say that there are no Gothic influences in Mary Roberts Rinehart's work, obviously we've already seen some. These covers make it seem like there's a lot more. And it's a shame, these are beautiful covers, but they don't really give you a good idea of the Mary Roberts Rinehart vibe. So I'm going to end here. Screen of some of my references. Screen of more references. And if anyone would like an easier to read version of the reference sheet, just let me know and I will be happy to send that to you. I'm
Oh,
easy to
45,
contact.
okay.